Oh, sure. I appreciate you letting me know. Yeah. All right. Good afternoon. Let's go ahead and get started for today. Welcome back. Happy 420. I'm glad this class is before later in the afternoon. So what you choose to do with yourself later in the day is your business. So let's go ahead and get going on today's new theory. And we'll also have a class presentation today from Presley. So Presley will be sharing uses of gratification, and then Angela will be sharing case negotiation on Friday. So we're continuing to move through these, and we'll have at least one person for each of these. So we heard from Riley, who had the chance to tell us about spiral of silence theory and use some good examples to help us thinking about how, like, if we have an unpopular opinion on sports, how that might cause us to be unwilling to share that opinion. We also talked about the first application paper for the course and just a few reminders going forward. So one of the ideas that was brought up in spiral of silence theory was blank, which refers to the pervasiveness of media, how pervasive it is. See who can take a stab at this one first. Yeah, Gavin. Ubiquity? Yes. Awesome work. So ubiquity, right, is how pervasive or common media is. That we have ubiquitous access to media sources means that when you're on your phone, right, you're suddenly getting news headlines, or people are talking about the news all the time as you're walking down halls, right, where you're getting all sorts of major updates. And the idea that it's always on and always here is a big deal. We talked last class about how after 9/11, right, we switched to what's known as the 24-hour news cycle. 9/11 happens, media outlets are constantly covering it, and people are constantly wanting to know what the heck has happened. And that's drastically shaped and changed the way that we use media. We still have that cycle of media happening. So just as a note on the first application paper for people that were not able to attend on Monday, I talked about this a bit, and I have the rubric available for you on Canvas, just like the previous assignments. It's due during the 6th week. And again, I'm asking you to pick a theory from the first 4 weeks and choose a communication artifact, right, a piece of communication that you can analyze. And again, I recommend that you're choosing a piece of communication that we can publicly access, right? For instance, something like an episode of a show or movie, rather than like a personal example between you and a friend. The reason for that is because if an example is clearly identified, right, you're able to help somebody who might not be familiar understand and work through your example, right? So the examples that we've been using in classes are examples of the types of artifacts that you could explore for this assignment. So I've tried to give you examples of things that you could choose to analyze. Again, it could be media, it could be public address or speech, it could be advertisements, or any other piece of communication that you feel like is a good fit, right? I think one trick for this assignment is going to be to really define clearly the scope of the artifact that you are choosing, right? So make sure you have a really clear piece of communication that you're connecting there. So that's that. Before we get started, does anybody have any questions, including anything we went over last class? So today we'll hear from Presley about uses and gratifications theory, or UNG. We'll then talk about some of the key assumptions and cornerstones of UNG and apply UNG to understand some contemporary issues. Again, UNG is a very media-focused theory, We'll continue to look at media today, and then we'll shift gears to talk a little bit about culture approaches to communication theories with face negotiation theory on Friday. So we have Presley doing a presentation for today. And for Presley, I received your information and slides. So those are right here for you. Again, the presentations are 4 to 6 minutes long. And so I'll let you know when you're at 4 minutes, you have 2 minutes. You're welcome to either quit or use arrows.
So I had uses and gratification theory. What is this theory? It discusses the effects of media on people. Something I noticed was like how people engage with the media. That's what it really focuses on. It doesn't really talk about how media affects people in a negative way, positive way. It explains how people use media for their own needs and become satisfied when those needs are met. The 5 needs and gratifications of people are cognitive needs, affective needs, personal integrative needs, social integrative needs, and attention-free needs. For the cognitive needs, the use of media for acquiring knowledge, information, facts, etc. So one of my biggest things I noticed was the quiz shows. A lot of us watch Jeopardy, and those are factual things. So we're engaged with that because it's actual knowledgeable, and the news, we're engaged with the news because it's current events, stuff like that. Search engines like Google, a lot of us use Google to search things. So affective needs includes all kinds of emotions, pleasure, and moods of people. Watching a sad scene in a movie and getting emotional, resulting in crying is one of the biggest ones that I noticed. Personal integrative needs, so self-esteem, racial status, gain credibility, and stabilize. So buying products that are high-end that you see on social media to change lifestyle. A lot of us in this generation focus on influencers and see, oh, she's got this really pretty necklace, or she has this awesome sweatshirt, or she just bought this brand new house that looks like this. I'm kind of interested in doing something like that because I want to be like this person. Same things like television ads, furniture, stuff like that. Social integrative needs comes as the need to socialize with family, friends, and relations in society, less face-to-face interaction, more use of social media, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok. These are all different ways we can communicate. I think Snapchat is really common in our generation too, just because we do have that face-to-face, but it's not a lot of pressure when you're actually in person. TikTok, we like to see videos, eventually become engaged with that specific person, the more we watch their videos. Instagram, posting pictures, you get more followers, likes, stuff like that. Tension-free needs, relief from tension and stress. Connectivity to the media is a way to take our minds off of other things that may be causing stress. This is what I mean by media doesn't really affect, it doesn't really talk about how media affects our negative aspects in our lives. So we do go to social media and it really is stress, but it doesn't really talk about how the mental, I don't know, the mental part of the negatives part. Concepts focus more on the use of media rather than the effects of media. Audience has full control over the effect of media on them. When needs are gratified, people get satisfaction. People are active participants in the media and are aware of their reasons for selecting different media options. And that's it.
All right, great, thank you. So thank you for getting us started in thinking about UMG. Again, this is a theory that, as Presley brings up, is really focused on our interest in using media. It's not necessarily looking at the effects or control that media has over us, but is in many ways flipping that around, right? And saying that we are the ones with power over how media impacts and affects our lives. So if you compare this to something such as agenda setting theory, it's essentially the polar opposite, right? One thing that I think is useful when we're exploring theories for this class to bear in mind is that not all of the theories, right, philosophically or socially align with each other. There are going to be theories that disagree with each other. So we have to think about where that source of disagreement comes from, why different theories disagree, and where you find yourself falling in terms of a theory maybe being more or less persuasive than others, right? So over changes in time and perspectives and opinions, ideas about the persuasiveness of certain theories of change. So what I want you to do to introduce us and get us thinking about some of the elements here of UNG is just to write or type and start to brainstorm in the average day, what media do you find yourself using? For instance, you might find yourself thinking about apps that you use on a pretty regular basis, television or film that you might watch, the use of your devices like laptops, tablets, phones, etc. And I want you to think about as many examples as you're able of times in which you utilize media and what media you use. One way to do this is to visualize the average day. You wake up, you probably check your phone or your alarm goes off. You see emails. You're browsing the internet in between classes or maybe during classes, right? What you're choosing to use media for is something I want you to start to think about. Another minute or two to finish your brainstorming here. I'll ask you to come back to this in a bit. So if you think of other examples later on in the class, you're welcome to write those down as well. Things. So I think as you're starting to brainstorm some examples, right, it's pretty clear that we actively choose to use media to fulfill needs every single day. In fact, we oftentimes do so without really thinking about it. There have been a lot of cultural and demographic shifts in how media has been incorporated in our lives too. For instance, I've noticed that it's increasingly common when people go out to eat that they'll have their phones on the table and will just do that as they're talking, maybe occasionally check their phone for updates, push notifications, and so forth. And as Presley mentioned, the prevalence of things like Snapchat and other ways to really easily engage online have made the usage of media a lot more common, right? And that ties to this week's theory of uses and gratification. which specifically argues the ways in which we choose to engage with media as a way of fulfilling our own specific needs, right? Again, this is the opposite of agenda setting theory. Agenda setting theory contends that media dictates the important issues and topics that we choose to talk about and think about in our own lives. For instance, right, the Balloon Boy hoax that we looked at was a topic that we cared about and we got attention for on the basis of its coverage and circulation and recirculation on media. We were told what was important and what we should pay attention to. Whereas instead, media is responding to our needs, right? We are self-aware. We see media, as you all start to write down and think about, as fulfilling what might be our personal or social needs and satisfaction, right? What do people do with media? Why do people choose media that we do? And why is that particularly important to us? Both in terms of the medium, how we access material. Are we using a phone, a laptop, or another device? And what is the specific content that we're accessing through media as well? So it takes a sociocultural lens because it's looking at how we as people make decisions about and choose media on our own terms. Also, a mass media approach, again, similar to other theories such as agenda setting theory and spiral of silence, and then similarly positivistic and empirical. And an example that I want to give is a trend that actually came up following COVID-19 lockdowns and shifts to how we see television and film. There were a number of films that were originally slated to be released in theaters and got switched over to either purely being released digitally through something like HBO Max or Disney Plus, or films that had what are known as simultaneous release, where they simultaneously get released on a platform for streaming and in a theater, right? So films such as Wonder Woman 84 were the first examples of simultaneous release in a theater and through streaming. Typically with streaming, it might involve an extra premium to pay for, right? And one of the interesting trends in what came up in that was noticing people's interest, motivations, and decisions behind whether or not they chose to see a movie at home using streaming or whether they went to go see it in the theater, knowing that both of those options were available at the same time. One thing that we now know is that there was significant more popularity to go see in theaters, and there's even been frustration by certain directors and creators of films that movies intended to be in theaters ended up only being released through streaming or primarily losing revenue as a result of streaming. A good example here are some of the Disney Pixar films that have recently come out through Disney Plus. So this theory comes from multiple communication scholars and authors. Specifically, Elihu Katz is considered to be the kind of pioneer of uses and gratifications theory. And they're concerned with how we use media in our own lives and how we actively make choices about media. And again, this theory started to be developed before we had this proliferation of access to apps, social media, and so on that I think has only magnified the ways that this theory has been used. So one of the ways to think about and contrast these approaches are differences between mass society and limited effects models of communication, right? Under the mass society model, it's this idea that media has major control over people's lives, that media not only tells us what to think, but tells us how to think. You can think about this as almost like media is pouring information into our heads and providing us with the basis on which we make decisions, right? Another model that's been used to describe it has been sort of like the needle or inoculation model, the idea that information is being injected into people. And that approach, again, is prevalent in some of the theories that we've talked about, like agenda setting theory. But the limited effects model, right, if we are thinking about media effects, effect is a question of what media does, how it influences, changes our attitudes or perception or behavior, right? For instance, we watch an action movie, and maybe we decide that we want to do martial arts and be like the people we saw on screen, right? That would be an example of mass society approach. Limited effects approach might be, that was interesting, that was a time waster, but it doesn't necessarily have a major influence on our lives. So, according to UNG then, our own differences, right, individual differences, which is where the cultural element comes in, based on who we are, on our interests and on our social needs, right, the way that we use social media and engage with other people is going to look really different. A generational example, right, how people use social media, for instance, more people using Snapchat or TikTok, more people using things like Facebook and Twitter are examples of the shifts that we've seen in individuality. And social categories. Again, we might think about factors like age, race, gender, sexuality, sexual orientation, and so on, as explanatory ways that people choose to use media. For instance, in COVID-19, right, when a lot of people were socially isolated and not able to see each other as often, we found ourselves more often seeking social relationships online. So, one way of thinking about UNG is if you use streaming, right? If you watch through any of the streaming services available, or if you are even within one particular app or device for streaming, there's a good chance that you have so much content to choose from and have probably spent a very long time trying to figure out what it is, right? Or even if you go on YouTube, right? There's a good chance that while there's like the algorithmically decided recommended videos, there are things that you have so much decision-making power to spend your time with, right? In fact, sort of early on, when Netflix was just getting started with exclusive content, with shows like House of Cards, right? Early on, it was kind of critiqued, and people were like, this is not going to take off. Cable news and cable TV and episodes being released each week are going to be the norm. It's not going to change. And now, sort of in streaming wars, right, we've seen a lot of apps that are designed to provide streaming content, a lot of shows that are exclusive to streaming services, and in many ways, a fight over content that is being provided through these streaming services, right? Which again goes to this approach that what you're choosing to subscribe to or what your parents are letting you watch because they've added you to your account are in many ways examples of UNG, right? The audience is active, and in many ways, media is goal-oriented. There are things that we want, and so we look for media to get them. We want to know what's going on in the world, right? We might choose to check the news and current events to figure out why. We might be done after a hard day and we want to unwind and eat some ice cream. That is another example of how we use media to fulfill goals. There's also an initiative in linking gratification to a specific medium choice that we choose to make. In other words, right, we as humans have the ability to identify a goal or issue that we need gratified and find media that meets that, right? So maybe you want to watch something light and silly, maybe you want to chat with a friend. You recognize for yourself what the goal is and how media fulfills that. Media compete with other sources for satisfaction. In other words, right, the streaming, the content wars that we're seeing right now, the question of Netflix having The Office, paying like millions of dollars to keep The Office on Netflix and then The Office getting moved over to Peacock are examples of media competition. They know that the show is popular, it gets subscribers, it gets attention, and so this competition for fulfilling that need is something that we see a lot. We have self-awareness of these motives, uses, and interests. And as a result of that, people who study media and communication using this theory can theorize or suggest how we get our needs met, right? They're likely to suggest this app or this source of media is popular because it's able to fulfill needs and get content on a regular basis. In fact, it's been interesting to follow some of the most watched shows A lot of the kind of shows such as Friends and The Office are among the most popular and top choices in streaming sites. And one of the reasons that they're considered the most popular is because people can really comfortably watch them in a very episodic way, right? You can turn it on, watch it, decompress. But a lot of shows that are released kind of exclusively on streaming sites are more episodic, right? You have to, or more serialized rather. You have to really understand what's happening in the previous episode. There's a more complicated story to follow. They're not as easy to have in the background. And so people have followed the popularity of shows that are on streaming sites and use that to sort of assess what's popular, what might be renewed, and what attention might be dedicated to. The value judgments of media content are only determined, informed by the audience. That is, in other words, if media is working or if it's not working, that's for us to determine. That might be a point of contention because there are some examples where things like Rotten Tomatoes score on a movie is going to dictate its popularity, but also examples of movies that are not necessarily critically successful, but get a lot of commercial success and people who like them. Discrepancies on shows that get like really bad Rotten Tomatoes scores, but like really good audience scores are examples of uses and gratification theory in action. So one way to think about UFG mathematically is as far as making decisions about media that we use in our own lives, we're a little bit lazy, right? Or at the very least, we like the path of least resistance. In other words, a mathematical formula that we can use to think about this theory is the expectation of the reward divided by the amount of effort required, right? In other words, if we know that there is a new show or a new season of a show just came out and we're really excited to watch it, right? We've been watching the show for a while and hooray, there's a new episode of Moon Knight on Disney Plus, right? We might choose to watch that knowing that we'll have a good experience, we'll get a distraction, and it doesn't require a lot of effort because all we have to do is go to the website or access the device and watch it on Disney Plus, right? However, if we know that doing something like going into a theater or signing up for a new app and creating an entirely new online profile and keeping updated on that is a lot of work, and we don't really think that it's going to be that enjoyable, we're probably not going to do it. We don't necessarily see it as worth the effort. That's a big reason that oftentimes we might be reluctant to start creating a profile on a new app just because we don't see it as worth our time to create a profile and jump through all the hoops that are needed to do so. So we make decisions about our media use based on this formula. As Presley brought up, right, we are using media in order to fulfill different types or styles of needs. One of them is a cognitive or knowledge-based need, right? So for instance, if we're checking the news or checking current events, we're doing so because we believe we want the knowledge and awareness about information, and media is going to do that, right? Or you find yourself checking a Wikipedia page of a topic or issue that you're interested in, or you're interested in going to eat somewhere new and you check a Yelp review online, right? The pursuit of knowledge and the ability of online outlets to provide that with that knowledge is one source of needs gratification. Another source is affective, right? Affect involves an emotional reaction to an event or issue. So oftentimes we seek media for an affective reaction. How many people are horror fans, like watching horror films? A couple of you, right? So people who enjoy horror films typically enjoy it because there's an affective reaction that you get from watching horror films. Other people strongly disagree and are not fans, right? The idea that yes, you get scared, there's like a jump scare, there's a psychological horror that like impacts you in this very visceral way and gives you this kind of thrill is an example of an affective need, right? It's like going on a roller coaster. So affective is an example of another need. A personal need being fulfilled, particularly related to your credibility or how you're being perceived as an individual is something else. So there's another theory that we talked about earlier in the term that related to how we choose to build our kind of identity online. Which theory was that?
That was the, someone talking about second leg. Is that the social penetration theory?
Not quite, but social is in there.
Social interaction theory. I know this. Social exchange theory.
No,
What?
close though. Yes,
That's it.
social information processing theory. So yes, so social exchange theory is about sort of transactions, right? The idea that we choose relationships interpersonally based on gain. Yes, so social information processing theory was this idea that we're developing this identity online. We're choosing our profile photos. We're trying to make ourselves look fun and exciting, right? You live in the Pacific Northwest and you see that like everybody's profile photos are like hiking photos, right? Or like photos of people holding fish. So the like usage of creating photos and that information are examples of how we choose to use media to present ourselves as people, right? Social, of course, is about connection to others. People brought up Snapchat being really popular and TikTok, right? One idea that's interesting that you'll see in a couple other theories is this idea of a parasocial relationship. A parasocial relationship is one-sided, right? It's the idea that you form a relationship with or connection to somebody like a celebrity or, you know, a famous figure or even somebody that doesn't have a huge following, but, you know, has some followers on social media. And by continuing to follow their content, it kind of feels like you understand and know a little bit about them, even though they have no idea who you are, right? So that as it relates to fandom and fan culture is one thing to think about too. And then also this idea of tension release of escapism, right? I think that one of the reasons that we really enjoy like science fiction or high concept films that are like an entirely different world, right, is because it brings us out of our own life into that. So what I want you to think about is returning to the activity I asked you to work on earlier, where you were brainstorming examples of media that you use on a regular basis. I want you to kind of start to sort and categorize these into particular needs that you need fulfilled. So you can put this next to the sources, or you could circle them or use code if you prefer. But would you put these under cognitive, affective, personal, social, or tension releasing? And you could put them under multiple, depending on if you see it as fulfilling multiple needs. I'll give you a little bit of time to work through and start to sort through that. I did the singular again, didn't I?
What is the singular form of media? If media is all encompassing, then what is the? That's a big, great question.
Would it be medium?
Probably.
It would depend a little bit on context.
Yeah.
Right.
say that's like texting your mom or, but not the for the affected emotional like stuff like that.
So I think it depends on what you expect going in, right? So if you expect an affect of, oh, it's so great to hear this exciting update from her, you know, hear that. Otherwise, it would probably be social media.
Just social media. But crying at the movies is effective because it's emotional release.
Yes. It'd be like an affective response. Like, so sad.
Show your feelers, people.
Like people are mostly about done, so I'll give another minute or two.
Is it okay to not have things in certain categories?
If there are things you feel like don't fit or fit in multiple, for sure.
It really does depend on the
Yeah, how you choose to show yourself as credible or authentic or representing who you are with other people.
I think I don't appreciate
Yeah.
I wish you could have like.
Yeah, I mean, and that's an example, right, of not feeling needs through there. Like a lot of people won't bother or won't create accounts specific places because they just don't see that as fulfilling needs.
Yeah.
What's that? The second one? Affective. It's like an immediate affect or emotional response you have to something. So, you know, you're scared when you see a horror movie.
Privacy really sad scenes, laugh really hard.
Yeah. So it's choosing media, in many ways, it's choosing media to feel something, right?
If you need a good laugh, you watch a really good. You need a good cry, you watch the way to strike jams.
Right, where you going? You went, you're right.
Yeah.
I can't watch it.
Yeah. So hearing people talk about this and sort of hearing the ways that people are thinking about these categories, I think there's a couple of useful considerations, right?
Okay.
One of them is the idea that sometimes, depending on day and situation, what we're receiving from media is going to look really different, right? There are certain times where we really like the idea of media to connect, right? You know, like you feel maybe an increased desire through isolation to connect socially with other people and more actively seek that, right? You say, maybe I'll drunk text my ex today, right? That's an example of how mood and situation can impact your use of social media. You know, again, depending on your mood, the feeling, right? If you're not feeling well and you want to watch something silly to feel better, that affective reaction plays a big role here too. right? So context and situation plays a big role. Why we choose media that we do is really impacted by that. But the idea that we're ultimately in charge of that we're picking media that curates our needs, again, gets at the core of UG. So kind of building off of that, right, the needs that we have and that we feel are coming out of our social situations. For instance, oftentimes we feel pressure through the course of our daily life that makes us want to receive these things, right? The idea that if we're working, if we're taking classes, if we're busy, right? Oftentimes we like the idea of getting pressure off. Another example might be if we're taking a break and checking our phones, right? Or we're messaging people, for instance, while we're working or when we have a break or something like that, right? It's a way of getting away from the stress or pressure that we're experiencing. Another idea is that we want to be aware of problems or issues. This gets at the idea that as humans, we like to be made aware of events or issues, or we like to be in the know because it helps us with forming social connections, right? We're talking with friends about what's going on in the brand, and in doing so, we can be in the loop. There also are real life opportunities that might restrict the needs that we have. So for instance, you've had a super long day, you have like 5 exams and you really just want to like decompress and spend time on your phone. That we have certain values that need to be met or fulfilled. For instance, if sort of family connections are really important to you, you might designate specific times to catch up with family using media. And also that we need to feel familiarity with media too. For instance, if we're choosing where we're receiving news and current events from, we might use that as a way of making our choices about the bookmarks or sites that we visit on a super regular basis, or what autofills when you do online searches. Another idea here, as we've talked about, is the idea that we as people have a level of agency and decision-making power on how we're using and incorporating media in our daily lives. One of these core concepts here is utility. That is, we assess the worth of the choices that are available to us. When we think about streaming and content wars, a really big source of how they compete is the quality of content that they have on offer, right? You're likely to choose something like Netflix or Hulu as a subscription because you know they have a lot of options available. But if there is a random like app, like something like Pop TV, you think, what the heck is on here, right? And choose not to watch it. Intentionality is another big element here that we choose with intent. So if we go on our phones and you're texting a friend, we're doing so because we see our need to connect with that person. Selectivity, we have a range of options that we could choose from, right? So again, all of these apps available to us are instances of us choosing among those available options. And the idea of being impervious to influence, which again is kind of one of the controversial and worthy of critique elements of this theory, that we make choices on our own without other people necessarily deciding for us how we choose to use media. It's ultimately our decision. So this theory has definitely received some critique, right? And I want to walk through some of the major pushback against this, since there are kind of 2 different camps, the limited effects versus the more powerful mass media approach. One of them, again, is that because this is a very broad theory, it covers a lot in terms of what it assumes about things like intentionality, about the needs that we need fulfilled, that maybe it's harder to really categorize or make clear why we use media. For instance, some of you were mentioning a little bit of pushback or confusion about what these categories were and what they meant, like an affective category. And there might be a lot of situations where you find that your use of media fits in a variety of different categories too. So media might be something we use for a lot of different reasons. Another idea here, right, is that media does not necessarily fulfill or meet particular functions that we have in our lives. In fact, media in many ways is almost like a stopgap or substitute in a lot of situations that doesn't necessarily meet the real thing. So for instance, about a year or two ago, my colleagues and I decided to do like a social gathering over Zoom because we didn't have the chance to see each other face to face. So we said, let's do a Zoom meeting and let's just chat. The trouble was that we had all gone through days of teaching on Zoom because we were at that era of COVID. And so we were kind of worn out of being on Zoom and we didn't really enjoy it that much. It wasn't a super great experience. So while we intended to use media to fulfill a social need, we ended up finding that the use of Zoom didn't quite work in really getting that need fully met compared to something like a face-to-face interaction, right? A lot of us have felt that over the last couple of years, that maybe using Zoom or remote options has given us some comfort and has addressed some issues, but maybe hasn't fully met needs that we might have, right? So in the same way that, forming a parasocial relationship with like a celebrity that you really like isn't quite the same as actually meeting and being friends with that person. Functional role of media is kind of limited. And then I think the last and I think most major critique to think about whether or not you think this theory or agenda setting makes more sense to you is a question of intentionality, right? There might be times where you find yourself just browsing and scrolling social media or messaging a friend or choosing something to watch. And it's not necessarily because you have a specific need that you need met. Maybe you're just bored. Maybe you do it out of habit, or maybe we have outside factors and influences that are telling us to focus on or care about an issue, right? The use of advertising, push notifications, and so on that tell us that we should care about or be invested in something is a good example of how media intends to influence us, right? For instance, I get a ton of notifications from DoorDash on my phone, like, hey, you should order from here. And I'm not thinking at all about getting something like takeout because it's expensive, but all of a sudden, right, it's not a need that I had, but this app is telling me, hey, maybe this is a need. Hey, remember us? And are trying to use creating a need as an example of media creating needs that we need to build rather than the other way around. So that's a thing that's worthy of critique too. And I touched on this already, right? But if we think about films that have this kind of simultaneous release in theaters and in streaming, again, Wonder Woman 84 was an example of this. Also, some of the recent Disney Pixar films like Luca and Turning Red. I think the Marvel film Black Widow was an example of this, and there was a lawsuit involving revenue related to the simultaneous release. So there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of controversy surrounding this practice. A lot of companies have shifted toward now only showing films in theaters again. But one of the things that was really interesting and striking, an example of UNG at play, are the motivating factors that are behind the decision of how people are seeking out media. So for instance, people who chose to watch in a theater over watching face-to-face in their own homes did so because they saw the use of sound, the experience of going to the theater, maybe the social needs of meeting with and interacting with a friend is more fulfilling. People who chose to stream maybe were concerned about COVID-19, like the idea of comfort, of being in their own space to watch a film and so on. So depending on the needs and the purpose that you saw associated with watching a film, you might choose to watch it in the theater or watch it through streaming or renting, right? So that factor in decision-making process is an example of how we might choose to use this theory and has explained the sort of audience demand for going and seeing a movie in the theaters versus seeing it through streaming. So to wrap up for today, we talked about UNG, how we use media to fulfill needs, the idea that UNG believes that media doesn't have a big impact on our lives, but we have a big impact on media, and also some of the critiques that are given about what it assumes about media's role in our lives. So for Friday, we're going to shift gears and move away from a discussion of media, instead to look at culture and interpersonal relationships, taking a non-Western approach to examine face negotiation theory, the way that we manage our reputation and roles online. So go ahead and either email or pass forward to me your attendance for today with your name on it. Have a great rest of your afternoon. We will reconvene again on Friday.